What was the first ever horror movie? It's a question that we've pondered time and time again throughout the history of this podcast. Many would argue that the first true horror film is Robert Wiener's The Cabinet of Dr Caligari in 1920, a German expressionist film about a homicidal somnambulist on a killing spree. But this film wasn't necessarily setting out to horrify audiences in the traditional sense. This was more like a psychological art house film, one that just happened to be incredibly unsettling. It wasn't until the back-to-back success of Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein and Paramount's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, all released in 1931, that the horror genre became a recognisable thing, a format.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
One could argue, therefore, that it was the following year, 1932, when studios began jumping on the success of these three films and trying to replicate them, that horror became an established genre.
It's St. John! We'll make her one of us! A loving cup!
It was in 1932 that MGM jumped on the horror bandwagon and had a go at making their own horror film. They hired Dracula director Todd Browning, who created a film that was considered at the time so shocking, so grotesque, that test audiences reportedly ran screaming from the movie theatre, resulting in 30 minutes of footage being cut for the film's theatrical release. But even after the cuts, and despite having a 60-minute running time, the film gained a reputation around the world, one that it still has today, for being one of the most shocking and extreme horror films ever made. Join me as we continue our journey through the mind and body as we discuss Robert Wiener's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Todd Browning's Freaks. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our journey through the mind and body in horror cinema, and this is part 3, in which, as that intro suggested, we are going to be deep diving into two early classics. On the psychological side, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and on the body horror side, Todd Browning's Freaks. Cannot wait. We've got lots to discuss, so let's get straight into it. I'm very excited to welcome this week's guest back to the podcast. He was here last series, also discussing a couple of early horror classics, Haxan and The Black Cat, and I'm so glad to have him back again. He is such a fountain of knowledge when it comes to early and silent cinema, and he is also a writer and one of the best horror actors working today. In fact, I would say he is our generation's Conrad Veidt. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast James Swanton. Hello.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be back in voice, if not in person.
I know, it's a bit sad, isn't it? I'm actually just looking at your little Skype photo, and it's just a kind of terrifying picture of you in some sort of costume, pulling some kind of horrific face.
Oh yes, I think that's me as Lucifer in the York Mystery Players, which was sort of patterned after Emil Jannings in the 1926 Faust, which is German Expressionism, which is very relevant to what we'll be discussing.
Oh, so. Perfect, yeah. Lovely. So first of all, let me ask you, how are you finding lockdown? How are you coping? Are you keeping yourself busy?
It's been a mixture.
Yes.
I've been saddled with work opportunities being cancelled or postponed left, right and centre, which I think is common to all of us freelancers. So I've had a reprise of my Henry Irving play called off, and I don't know when that'll come back. I've had a short film delayed till October. A feature film I was due to do in June is now happening in August, fingers crossed. Just things like that all over the place. But, on the plus side, I've been shooting a horror film in lockdown, which,
wonderful!
Oddly enough, is something that wouldn't have existed without this terrible global situation we're in. So there is a silver lining.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And actually, I've been talking to people about this on the podcast. You know, we've been talking about whether or not, what will this do, of course, to the film industry and to the horror industry. And in some ways, I'm kind of intrigued to see what horror filmmakers are going to do now that they have these restrictions in place. Are people going to be shooting these really interesting films, maybe all set within one location and all this kind of thing? Because I think in some ways this kind of could breed, good creativity and imagination.
Well, it's a point we may be making later on this podcast, because I think it's very germane to Caligari in particular. Horror often thrives on limitation.
Yes.
Low budgets and I suppose being forced or squeezed into a position where the imagination has to take over. I mean, I'm back in York now, where I live most of the year. But yesterday I was in Watford for a full body casting for a film I'm doing in August. So it was interesting, just in that respect, to see the new restrictions already in place. So it was it was more than usual, like being in a mad scientist's laboratory. Everyone had lots of PPE on, and rightly so, and it just gave an extra surreal veneer to what is already a very odd way to be manipulating your body.
I love it. I love it. So let's dive straight into what we're going to be talking about. Let me first of all just briefly ask you, how do you find these kind of areas? I mean, for example, body horror, traditional body horror, like, for example, the works of David Cronenberg and that kind of thing. Are you a fan of these sorts of movies? How do you find them?
They're not particularly my go-to option when I sit down to watch a horror film, but that, I think, is purely chronological. These films were made after 1936. I do really enjoy body horror, though. I think transformation as an idea is so central to how we relate to horror as a genre, and maybe it's embedded very, very deeply in our subconscious or our collective conscious. Going back to evolution, the idea that we've all transformed from one thing into another over millions and millions of years. And horror, to my mind, just speeds up that process. So a werewolf transformation, Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. But I suppose even more fascinating, where this particular area you're focusing on is concerned, is when the transformation goes from the bodily into the mental or psychological sphere. Teasing out the interconnections between the two. I think that's going to be really, really interesting. Very rich.
Yeah, I hope so. Absolutely. And, I find, I find that this kind of thing quite scary. There's nothing scarier, I think, than whatever these kind of binaries mean. For example, sane and insane, or mad and sane, or whatever you call it. This idea of your own mind failing you in some way is a scary concept. I suppose in the same way that your own body deteriorating and failing on you is quite a scary concept. So they make good material for horror, I think.
Absolutely.
So let's get into it. We're going to start off by discussing this classic, often considered one of the very first horror movies, and we'll see about that. We'll discuss that a bit further. But The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920.
We begin with three very strange, very haunting figures. So there is an old man who says his life has been taken over by spirits which have driven him from his family and his home. There is a young woman in a trance-like state, dressed all in white, and there is a young man, who we learn is called Francis, who begins to tell us a framing story. Now, this is a framing story that carries us through ever more tightly binding frames. So we go from his narration to a very twisted medieval town. Within that very twisted medieval town is an even more twisted carnival. We are taken through the carnival into a carnival tent, and within that tent is a cabinet and this is The Cabinet of Dr Caligari.
I love that. That's a really interesting thing that you've just said there, the way that we kind of go in and then we go inwards and then we go inwards some more. It's something I hadn't really thought about.
It's a gathering claustrophobia.
Yes, that's fascinating. So tell me, first of all, let's just start with what your own personal history is with this film, James. Are you a fan of it, first of all? And do you remember your kind of first experience of watching it?
I think my answers to those two questions interrelate, really. My first viewing of it was on DVD in the early to mid-2000s, and I think I talked about this last time on the podcast, but silent film was my entire entry gate into the world of classic horror cinema. I'd been fascinated by images of Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera from a very early age, a while before I was able to see the film, but that led me to seek it out on DVD, and I was taking in these films at a point when we were in an odd no man's land between television showings and YouTube. So these films weren't regularly seen on television anymore, except for the very occasional screening, nor had the internet opened up virtually everything to an interested consumer. So I sought out the Phantom of the Opera because I'd been tantalised by the images. And I think the second horror film I saw was Nosferatu. And again, I was tantalised by the images of this incredible monster creation. Now, The Cabinet of Dr Caligari, in all of my reading, it struck me as a much more important film than an exciting film. I couldn't quite get my head around it in the abstract. I had an idea of Caligari as being much more about a style than a monster. And it's a point worth making, I think, that 1920, the year Caligari came out, was kind of a banner year for monster films. So you had John Barrymore as Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde, and anyone who's seen Barrymore's Mr Hyde will probably agree it's the most viscerally terrifying monster in any silent film. 1920 was the year where we got Lon Chaney's first mature horror performance in The Penalty, where he plays the legless gangster Blizzard. And 1920 was also the year of The Golem, with Paul Wegener. Probably his really great shot at a canonical version of that monster he returned to so many different times. So Caligari, by comparison, didn't seem too tantalising. I thought, well, this is a film without a monster. What's a somnambulist? Am I even pronouncing this correctly? Actually, on a closer inspection, Caligari is full of monsters. You have the prototype misunderstood monster in Cesare. He's like a combination zombie and Frankenstein monster. You have the prototype Mad Doctor in Caligari, and the style of the film itself is a kind of monster. I think back to what Roger Corman said when he was making House of Usher. There's this legend that Corman has put about that he essentially got the film made by saying to the powers that be, "What do you mean there's no monster? The house is the monster." I think Caligari falls into this bracket. The style of the film is a monster. You asked me whether I'm a fan. I definitely am. I still regard it as a film I respect a bit more than one I out and out love.
Yes.
But I don't think that's in any way to Caligari's detriment. In fact, quite the contrary. I think it's probably a gauge of the film doing its job properly. You shouldn't be able to get too close to something so disturbing. It doesn't want you to get too close to it. I think really of the great mantra that drives the asylum director mad towards the end of the film, that flashback within a flashback. You must become Caligari. You kind of have to get into a similar accommodation with this film. You have to let it take you over, maybe even possess you, and good Lord, I mean, there's no other way to approach it, really. It's fiendishly complicated. It's almost the Mulholland Drive of the 1920s.
I agree.
Unlike Mulholland Drive, you can watch it as a fairly straightforward film, but I believe it's equally complex and equally unreadable.
Yes, it's very interesting because not only does it have a reputation as being one of the earliest horror movies, I think it's also kind of in some ways you could regard it as one of the earlier horror / art house movies as well. This idea that it's the style, it's the mood, like you say, that's a perfect way to put it, that the monster is the style of this film. And then it brings to mind, to me, movies like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, maybe, this idea of kind of madness, but also it's in the cinematography, it's in the production design, it's everything, it's kind of soaking up the movie. And again, David Lynch is a great example of that as well.
Yes.
Like you say, there's that kind of, I just want to keep saying the word madness in a way, but there's that feeling of unease in kind of every element of this film, I suppose, from the beginning.
Absolutely permeated with unease, and madness is central to everything this film does.
Exactly. So I'm going to come back to that, but first of all, let me ask you a little bit about this character of the somnambulist, I suppose, who I would say is, one of the most iconic images maybe of this film is that image of this somnambulist, in the cabinet, opening his eyes, looking down the camera lens, played by, of course, Conrad Veidt. Tell me a little bit about, now we did touch briefly on this, I think, in our last discussion, but you're a big fan of Conrad Veidt. Tell me a little bit about your sort of relationship with this man as an actor, and how you discovered him and what you love so much about him.
Oh, this could take a very long time. You're going to have a very difficult edit with this, Mark. As I speak to you now, Conrad Veidt's portrait is looking down on me. I managed to fish it off eBay last year, and it's autographed, and it gives me a very direct and visceral sense of connection to this man who, as you say, is central to this film, which is now 100 years old.
It's amazing, isn't it?
And feels older, really. It's a very odd film in that respect. Conrad Veidt. How to do justice to Conrad Veidt? Well, I suppose relevant to this podcast, Conrad Veidt is certainly, to me, cinema's first really sophisticated horror actor. There had been prior horror actors, none more ubiquitous than Paul Wegener, who did in 1920 reprise his role as the Golem and played it quite a few times in various other films which are now regrettably lost. And Wegener had also made what is often considered the first feature-length horror film, The Student of Prague, in 1913. Conrad Veidt, I'd like to point out, would remake The Student of Prague in 1926, playing the same part, and by comparing the two films, you can see the difference between the two men. Wegener was kind of a throwback to an older age of acting. He was quite primitive and quite broad. He was ideal to play clay coming to life, because if you look at his face, even out of the Golem makeup, he has that sort of appearance, a big, heavy, gothic, outsize looking actor. Conrad Veidt first entered film in 1917 in a film called Fear. Now, most actors don't arrive on screen with their star image, their persona, whatever you want to call it, fully formed. Conrad Veidt kind of did. He's playing a revenant who has come to take revenge on a man who has stolen an artifact, and he's haunting this rambling castle, and introduced in that film is everything we lovers of Veidt associate with him and cherish. The mesmeric quality, the sort of air-displacing stillness of the man. The fact that through some clever optical work he can go from being a corporeal presence to being a transparent presence, an ethereal ghost. It really does carry a true chill of the grave. And following on from this, Veidt delivered so many canonical horror performances. Caligari, obviously, probably his most famous. Relevant to body horror, of course, The Hands of Orlac, where he plays the pianist who, at least in that version, believes he has had the hands of a murderer grafted onto his stumps after he's been in a train accident. That's almost a one-man film. He controls it all with his performance. It's an absolutely stunning tour de force. And, of course, The Man Who Laughs, which has grown in popularity over the last few decades and is, of course, another kind of body horror.
Yes.
Veidt has Jack Pierce's first great monster makeup in that film. And, of course, the reason Veidt excels in the part is because he always lets you see the mind behind the body. He lets you in emotionally. There's numerous stunning moments in that film where he will cover his mouth and you just focus on the eyes and they're like shattered glass. The emotional reach of that film is absolutely extraordinary, even now. And indeed, when Veidt went into sound films, he became even more of a mystical figure. I can't remember, but last time I may have talked about some of Veidt's sound film performances. Rasputin, The Wandering Jew. These films are quite hard to track down, but they are remarkable bits of acting. His Rasputin is one of the most frightening performances I have ever seen in a film. There are a few short clips on YouTube. I encourage all and sundry to watch them, study them, thrill to them, because he is brilliant. So you have all of this. Conrad Veidt's value as a pioneering horror actor is inestimable. Beyond all of this, Conrad Veidt was an absolutely splendid human being. Now, there's often this thing put about all the horror actors. It's a kind of commonplace where it's like, oh, they played monsters, but they were the nicest person who ever lived. I mean, it's very often true. You think of Peter Cushing, you think of Boris Karloff. Conrad Veidt was more than just a nice human being. He was a bloody hero. You can trace this all the way back to pre-Caligari. The year before Caligari, he made a film called Different from the Others, often considered the very first pro-gay film.
Oh, wow.
Conrad Veidt was not himself gay, yet he plays this gay pianist who falls into a very tragic romance and has an unhappy end, and essentially risked his career to do that. We're only a few decades after Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency, admittedly in another country, but the stigma in which men who loved men were held can't really be underrated. But you can still see that film. It's available on the internet now. Veidt gives a very compassionate performance, and you can see in that the seed of him being wonderful at playing sympathetic characters who are deemed to be monsters by the world at large. So, I mean, speaking as a gay actor who does horror myself, I feel greatly indebted to Veidt for that sort of crossover. But beyond that, and this is where things get really remarkable, I think, come the 1930s, Conrad Veidt took a pretty extraordinary stand against the rising Nazi party. The Nazis, on coming into power, started to send papers to the citizens of Germany, asking them to declare themselves. What is your ethnic background? What is your racial heritage? Conrad Veidt would scrawl on these papers in block capitals, Jew! And then he would send them back. Conrad Veidt was not Jewish, I have to add. His wife was Jewish, and he was so fucking angry at these fascist monsters prying into his life that this was a stand he was willing to take. Things got so bad that Veidt was entertained. It's a laughable verb in this context, but it's one I'll use. He was entertained as a guest of the state by the Nazi party. This essentially meant that Veidt was locked up in a hotel room, in a hotel, under supervision by the Nazis, drawn into another room every day and asked to sort of declare his solidarity with the party.
Wow.
Hideous bullying, monstrosity. It's just absolutely grotesque. And Veidt was playing quite a dangerous game because he'd rightly banked on the fact that because he was such a great star a star of international renown, it would be far more damaging for the Nazi Party to eliminate him, as they would have eliminated an unknown actor, than to comply with him and try and coax him round to their way of thinking. Veidt ultimately decided to have none of this. He fled to England, and there he made a film called Jew Seuss, which is an incredibly compassionate testimony to a Jewish character that's often demonised. I mean, the great tragedy of Conrad Veidt's life is he died very young. He was 50 when he died. He died on yet another golf course of a heart attack, very suddenly and very unexpectedly. And even more sadly, that was quite a few years before the war was won, so he didn't live to see Hitler defeated. He didn't live to see a kind of peace brought back to his homeland. But yeah, I mean, I hope I've done justice to Veidt there. I could go on for a long, long time.
Well, it's wonderful.
Well, it's already been a long time.
No,
but,
I mean, it's wonderful, James. And also, tell us, you are actually writing a book about Conrad Veidt, is that correct?
Well, about Conrad Veidt, yes, and also about 12 other actors. So the working title is Malignant Heroes, and Conrad Veidt is the first chapter, and I shall be going through, as I say, 13 actors, all the way from Conrad Veidt and Lon Chaney to the likes of Christopher Lee and Barbara Steele.
Brilliant.
So that's I mean, it's been taking me years because I've just been working at it on and off between bits of acting work.
Yes.
But that's my attempt to sort of apply a version of auteur theory to actors.
Great.
So each of the chapters focuses on what I consider 3 canonical films for the actor that's being studied there, and looking for sort of through lines and connections and thematic unity and continuity. So that's been a very, very rewarding study over the last few years. I'm really, really enjoying writing it, and God willing, I'll finish it within the next few years.
I love it. That's wonderful. So, his performance in this, like we said, it's one of the more iconic performances in this film and in sort of early horror cinema, I would say, really. Do you think, do you find him, is he a frightening presence in this film for you, would you say?
I find that very hard to answer, really. A lot of people have said that his First Awakening is one of the most frightening single shots they've seen in a film.
Yes.
I can agree with that to some extent, but beyond anything, I just find Cesare kind of enigmatic.
Yes.
And pathetic. He's very like Edward Scissorhands in that respect. He's a kind of visual foreshadowing of Edward Scissorhands. He's pitiable and quasi-romantic. I mean, not for nothing is the final glimpse of Cesare in the film him stroking a flower, but also sort of removing all of its petals as he does so. It's an image that is at once very, very tender and extremely destructive. And I suppose it's those dueling energies that make Cesare such a compelling figure. He is both villain and, well, he appears to be a villain, but more than that, he is a victim.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, very true. I guess something that we'll see quite a lot going forward in the horror genre, these sympathetic, monsters, if we want to call them that, these sympathetic villains / victims. Yeah. It's very interesting. So tell me a little bit let's talk a bit about, I suppose, one of the key elements of this film, which is that look, that style, what's now very much known as German Expressionism. Tell us a little bit about what that means, James. I think it's a very difficult. It's a very difficult thing to define, I suppose, deliberately so, isn't it?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I suppose in short form, German Expressionism could be defined as a meeting point between a subject matter and a style.
Yes.
So if we think of placing all the films that have been defined as expressionist on a Venn diagram, I suppose Caligari would cross over more on a Venn diagram than any other film.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because the style of Caligari is unusually extreme, and the subject matter is equally so. And, I suppose possibly another way to define German Expressionism, which might help, is it inverts that which is normal. So I think the term mental landscape, which is much used and much abused, and I'm possibly abusing it now, but the term mental landscape, and the idea that interior states, internal states, can be made external. I can't think of many films to which that is more applicable than Caligari, where the entire design of a film seems to have been infected by this disease of madness.
Yes, exactly that. And I think it's the, I suppose nothing, like you said, it's the kind of anti-realism, it's anti-naturalism, I suppose, in a way, isn't it? And I think because of the way this story is framed and how obviously we discover that really this whole story is, I guess, taking place in somebody's head or told by an unreliable narrator in some way. It is like the whole film is styled in that manner that we are, everything is just a bit off. And so we have these kind of extreme angles and shadows. There are scenes of people sort of bustling streets, but really it just looks like a kind of stage set and people kind of wandering around in circles and this kind of thing.
Now, there's just an endless wealth of incidental detail, which is delightful to acquaint yourself with on every viewing. I'm always very fond of that flight of stairs, which has a lighter section painted on it, so by default the darker sections stand in for shadows, and the actors actually adjust their footwork, so they're always walking on the light portion of the staircase. It's full of glories of that sort.
Does it do the job effectively, I suppose, in telling what this story is, which I suppose is the story of madness or some kind of variation on that?
Well, I think answering that question depends on figuring out what we mean by telling the story.
Yes.
I mean, are you referring to the ending of the film by any chance, or?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah. Exactly. This idea that everything we've seen may or may not have been false or an illusion or whatever it might be.
Yeah, well, that twist ending, I mean, the first thing that must be said is the twist ending will probably become a big feature of this series, because so many of the films which I've seen on your secret master list, they do pivot on some kind of twist ending. I suppose Caligari is one of the earliest examples of a twist ending done really, really well, because a bad twist ending tends to be one which can't be justified. I mean, we all think of the stereotype, it was all a dream. It's always very dissatisfying. I suppose with this, it was all a nightmare is more applicable. But the thing with that is the nightmare doesn't really end when we get out of the inset story. It's curious reading about the history of this film, because the writers, in particular, thought the twist ending in the film as it was made was a terrible betrayal of their story. They thought it undermined its importance. They thought they had, well, at least retrospectively, they said they thought they had put into their story, and I think that's an important thing to point out. The film became a phenomenal art house industry, and everyone was desperate to claim credit for it and say, what they felt was brilliant in it, and therefore the degree to which they were responsible for what they thought was brilliant in it. Anyway, the writers didn't care for the twist ending because they thought it undermined the messages they put into the story about authority being tyrannical and the world having gone mad. I mean, you can trace a lot of this to Germany having come out of the First World War. But I defy anyone to say that the twist ending really makes the film more comforting. I think it does absolutely the opposite. It makes everything more subversive. And this is entirely due to the way the twist plays out. Which leads me to my question to you, Mike. What makes us think that Francis is an unreliable narrator?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. I guess what I mean is, at least upon first watch, I think that the film sets itself out to have a kind of twist ending, I suppose. So we have this framing device where this man is telling this other person this story. And then we go into the story and everything is, as we said, it's very expressionistic. It's very otherworldly. It's very unreal. We're not in a kind of place that is rooted in any kind of naturalism throughout this whole story. And I think that adds to the idea that what we're seeing is, like I said, it's a bit off, isn't it? It's not really to be trusted. There's something unstable about this narrative. Then the framing device, the kind of the ending that we're presented with, is that Francis, this character who's been telling us this story, is actually an asylum inmate, right? So, and all of these people that were part of this story are all other inmates. In this way, it is a very Mulholland Drive, a very David Lynch-esque ending where our narrator, the person telling the story, has kind of recast the people in his life as players within this thriller, this fantasy world that he created. And we have people like Dr. Caligari. The character of Dr. Caligari is actually the asylum kind of doctor or director, right? So I think that the film is revealing to us there that everything we've seen previously isn't real, and that the end section of the film is the quote-unquote reality. Have I got that right?
Yeah. It's very interesting that the film opens with that scene on the bench in a kind of garden area. And that's the image we return to at the closure of the story, as Francis finishes telling his tale. It's interesting because that garden-type courtyard area, it could pass for naturalistic. But then we go back into the asylum, and it looks almost exactly the same way it did during the storytelling. It's the expressionistic set design still in place. Some of the characters look a bit less outlandish than they did within the story. So Conrad Veidt, for example, is not wearing a sort of a one-piece body-hugging suit. He's now got a pair of trousers on.
Yes.
And Caligari is purposefully made to look unsettlingly mundane as compared to how he has appeared. But it has to be said that this is still not an asylum that you could locate in the real world without running away from it screaming.
It's very true, yeah.
And then the way the asylum director comports himself is really the final nail in the coffin with regards to this idea that the framing device is in any way comforting or reducing. I mean, we never get any sense of who the asylum director really is. I'm sure you'll remember the last intertitle, where I think Caligari says words to the effect of, "Ah, yes, now I understand what his problem is. He thinks I am that mystic Caligari. Now I know how to cure him." That's a very interesting thing to say. Because when you think about it, Francis's problem is not what the asylum director says it is. And this is where things start to get a bit Mulholland Drivey in terms of complication. Francis's delusion, if it is indeed a delusion, is not that he believes the asylum director to be that mystic Caligari. Francis's delusion, as we have seen, if it's a delusion, is that he believes the asylum director believes that he, the asylum director, is the mystic Caligari.
Yes.
So what happens at the end is the asylum director's delusion is put on Francis, and we never get anything approaching a proper closure. I don't think anyone can look at that final malignant shot of Werner Krauss and believe this man is going to cure Francis. And interestingly enough, that final shot of Werner Krauss staring towards the camera with the camera doing its kind of iris in effect, it exactly parallels the very first shot we had of Dr. Caligari.
Yeah.
Who is in control of this story? We can have a good idea it's this character Werner Krauss is playing, but who is Werner Krauss playing? Is he the asylum director? Is he this mystic Dr. Caligari that the asylum director has become obsessed with? Which version of the asylum director is he? It's never satisfactorily resolved. And I suppose this might go back to what we were discussing at the start of the podcast, the idea of this fluid transformation. Despite all the very angular, jagged, fixed lines of the sets of Caligari, it sets human actors in the middle of them, and I suppose in a way the whole film is a vessel that's containing these transformations between the real and the unreal, and from one identity into another.
Oh my God, it's making my brain hurt.
I know. Yeah, it took me quite a few viewings to wrap my head around the plot of Caligari, and even now I may return to it and come to a different view.
Oh, well, I love it. I guess that's what makes it such an important and historic film, and it is, like you say, it's a tricky one to completely get your head around, and I think it does feel like an experience. You know, you talk about Mulholland Drive, I think this is similar to Lynch, and sometimes it's less important to understand the story and more just let the experience wash over you, I suppose.
Yeah, and I suppose as well as a kind of closing remark on Caligari.
Yes.
It's often called a very influential film. I don't really see that myself. I see The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as being absolutely itself.
Yeah, one of a kind, yeah.
I mean, the designs are said to have been influential on films that came after. I don't think that really works when you start to look at it. You can identify particular scenes or particular sequences, set pieces in other films that have a Caligari-esque look. So there's that film you and I both love, Mike, The Night of the Hunter, and, you know, you have the odd set piece in that which is absolutely German Expressionism gone mad. So you think of the attic scene where Robert Mitchum is with Shelley Winters and something terrible happens with a knife, and you think as well of that later scene during the children's escape down the river where they encounter that farmhouse which looks like a sort of black cutout, this kind of stencil imposed on the horizon, and the picket fence is likewise a silhouette. And
I love it. Yeah.
There's that bird in the cage, but the majority of the film is closer to the expressionism of a film like Nosferatu, in that it takes place in something that passes for our world. It takes place within the fecundity, the almost sickly fecundity of nature. So
yes.
Yeah, it's a law unto itself, Caligari, and you know, one of the things I find most wonderful about it is how mischievous that style is, because you're completely right to say it's an art house film. In fact, that was part of the thinking behind its design. Germany was in a position after the war where they kind of wanted to break into the film markets of other countries, and they soon identified the only way they could do this was by making films of an elevated and artistic nature, and they hit the bullseye with Caligari. It caused a very big stir when it was finally screened in America. So you have the that side of its reputation, but then you think of what the producer Eric Pommer said in Aftertimes about the thinking behind Caligari. He said the writers approached him thinking this was an experiment, but what I saw was the opportunity to make a relatively cheap film. And that draws us to the kind of carnivalesque side of Caligari. It features a circus, and like many great horror films, it kind of draws us into the carnival world. It's like a barker shouting at us, come and see something shocking. Because the design is shocking, and the design is about working with a limited budget but making every penny count for something. It's like Carnival of Souls in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely, so much so. And isn't it interesting that so many of these films that are, you know, lauded, rightly so, for all of these artistic decisions are so often practical or financial, or they're working to constraints, you know, and that, of course, always probably has more of an influence on how these films are made than other kind of bigger conceptual ideas that we then sort of project onto them.
Yes, and I think rightly so. filmmakers should think of their audiences first, and I think many filmmakers who claim to be labouring solely for artistic purposes, they are secretly thinking of that audience.
Yes. Yeah, no, definitely. It's a fascinating film, and it's probably one of those films you could talk about for hours and hours, and there are probably whole libraries of books about it, like you mentioned. But I'm going to move on,
right.
Especially with that lovely segue you mentioned there about carnivals and come and see the show and everything. I mean, what a lovely way into the next film we're going to talk about. So we're going to jump forward a decade now, and we are going to talk about Todd Browning's wonderful Freaks from 1932.
We didn't lie to you, folks. We told you we had living, breathing monstrosities. You laughed at them, shuddered at them, and yet, but for the accident of birth, you might be even as they are. They did not ask to be brought into the world, but into the world they came. Their code is a law unto themselves. Offend one, and you offend them all. And now, folks, if you'll just step this way, you are about to witness the most amazing, the most astounding living monstrosity of all time.
A carnival barker is getting us ready to clap our eyes on one of his most monstrous freaks. A freak who at this early stage of the film will go unseen. So our next hour is to be spent with some of the most extraordinary people ever captured in any film, and we will find out how a woman who was at least outwardly beautiful went from being the so-called peacock of the air to being a grotesque and disturbing duck of the earth.
I love it. That's brilliant. So first of all, James, tell me, what do you think of this bonkers film?
Well, I will confess, first of all, that this isn't by any means my favourite Todd Browning film. I think The Unknown, his 1927 melodrama of armlessness starring Lon Chaney, is probably his masterpiece. And, if I was just going to put a Todd Browning film on for fun, I think I'd go for one of his later 30s horror films, Mark of the Vampire or The Devil Doll. All of that said, I definitely regard Freaks as Todd Browning's most fascinating film.
Mm-hmm.
Though this may be as much or more to do with the kind of discussions it generates, rather than its actual achievement as a piece of cinema. I have a fairly extensive collection of horror films on DVD by this point, and by far the DVD that people who aren't into horror particularly, and certainly not classic horror, by far the DVD that most of those people request most of the time, it's always Freaks. It's always Freaks people are interested in. It's a film whose reputation absolutely precedes it, and I suppose it might be becoming nowadays one of the most viewed films of the 30s, because even people who aren't really into older films are aware of it and sort of fascinated by it and tantalised by the extremity of its reputation. It's really interesting as well that you described this film as, what were the adjectives you used? Bonkers and baffling.
Well, it is quite bonkers.
No, I completely agree. It's absolutely off the scale mental, but I would argue that it's probably more insane in the way that, I think its bonkers and baffling elements are more wrapped up in it being strange in the way that early sound films are than strange in the way that Freaks is in particular.
Right,
You find this especially with Todd Browning's early sound films. Dracula is also very much in the vein of Freaks, in that the pervasive weirdness of the acting is second to none. In the case of Freaks, let's look at Olga Baklonova playing Cleopatra. You will not find, outside of maybe a Disney villain, anyone on Earth who sounds or behaves anything that approaches Olga Baklonova in this film. Yes. I don't think it's a bad performance in any way, but it's alarming, the kind of extremity and the intensity of it, and the thickness of accent and just the sheer theatricality of it. You feel transported back to the theatre of the 19th century in a way. And, you know, on top of the weirdness of so many of the performances, you have the weirdness of the soundscape that's created. And, you know, there are certain sounds, quite apart from Google Gabble, which, you know, ring in the memory for a long, long time. Yeah. Sounds that I'm sure David Lynch would kill to be able to recreate in this day and age. Yeah. And also in common with a lot of films of the early 30s, it feels sort of a little unfinished. The pace is kind of choppy. There are story elements and threads which are left dangling a bit. So you have all of that, and then you implant within it all of these, as I said in the introduction, extraordinary human beings who you won't find in such concentration in any other film. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's there's a lot I want to pick up on there, what you just said, but you know, you're right about it having that reputation. I think even people that aren't particularly into, you know, early cinema and older horror will know of and be curious about this film, I think. And it's that weird curiosity in all of us of wanting to see, you know, people like this, I suppose, and like you said, some of the most extraordinary people, you know, that you'll see in cinema, I think, in this film. And it also has that reputation. It had that reputation as being in some way extreme. You used the word extremity there with this film, and this kind of almost kind of controversially shocking in some way. You know, there are stories, of course, that this film is quite choppy because it was quite severely chopped after test screenings, and audiences found it just too much, and so large chunks of it were removed, which is really interesting, and it's something that we're going to go forward talking about quite a lot as well in this series, this idea of extreme cinema, and often it links with the body or the mind, you know, being pushed to its absolute limit, I suppose. But it's interesting in the context of this movie, because really, you know, is this movie even a horror film, at least for the bulk of it? I mean, would you call, you know, do you think, does this film feel like a horror movie to you?
Well, I suppose it's important first to establish that, nominally at least, this is a horror film. Yes. MGM authorised its production to be a horror film. In fact, a horror film to out-horror Hollywood's previous horror films.
Exactly,
It had all shown in some form in 1931 Dracula and Frankenstein from Universal, and then Paramount's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
So Freaks came early on in the talking horror cycle, and I suppose because it came so very early on, they hadn't quite cracked the formula of what made this sort of film work. So Freaks, I find, ticks very, very few conventional boxes. And yeah, it doesn't feel particularly coherent as a narrative. Last time we were together on this podcast, we talked about Haxan. And Freaks, in a similar way, feels kind of documentary-like.
That's right, yeah.
Maybe even like a very early Mondo film. I really do believe you could fit most of the truly important plot details of Freaks into about 20 minutes, but that still leaves us another 40 minutes of stuff which is extraneous on a straight narrative level, but is really, really very crucial to, you know, what makes Freaks so incredibly compelling. Yeah, is it a horror film? It's a Todd Browning horror film. I think that's as close as we'll get. Yes. I mean, that has to be annotated a bit, really, because Dracula with Bela Lugosi is obviously also a Todd Browning horror film, but that to me is a bit like saying The Fly is representative of David Cronenberg, or The Elephant Man is representative of David Lynch.
Right.
It's kind of the more conventional Gone Hollywood film. Whereas Freaks is an extremely personal Todd Browning film in that you have so many of the things that this particular director was obsessed with. So you have the circus backdrop, and Todd Browning had worked early in his life in circuses and felt a very intimate connection to them. And, the circus is also the backdrop in The Show, Todd Browning's silent film, and The Unknown, which, I said earlier is probably his greatest film. You have the kind of kinky interest in sex, which permeates most of Todd Browning's really great films, usually with Lon Chaney thrown in there to make proceedings even more unnerving. And, while we're talking about Chaney, the very Browning fixation of human bodies kind of falling apart or in a state of disintegration. I certainly don't mean to do a disservice to the real deformities of these people, because I think if there's any message in this film, they are the more complete ones. They are the whole ones. And it's, funnily enough, it's Cleopatra who appears to have everything desirable to a human being who does become broken, who must fall apart. Is pushed towards that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because that's the thing that I wrestle with this film, because in some ways it paints a very sympathetic portrayal, I think, of these characters, of these sideshow performers.
Yes.
In a way that it doesn't feel like the film is trying to shock you or frighten you because of these quote-unquote freaks,
Yes.
But then, of course, there's that final act when they attack, and it is a frightening kind of climax, I suppose, to this film.
Oh, yeah.
So it's interesting. What do you make of that in the way that Browning portrays these people and these characters? Does it lend a sympathetic eye, ultimately, to these sideshow performers?
I would say, on the whole, yes. This is a sympathetic, almost humane kind of treatment of these people. The ending, as you rightly point out, is something that needs to be confronted and dealt with almost separately from the rest of the film. Because it doesn't quite seem to line up with the rest of the film. Although, I don't know, I think there are mitigating factors you can apply to the ending. Maybe the treatment of the extraordinary people in this film is less humane than human. And I say that because there is a kind of rawness and a messiness in the way these people are presented. I was very struck a few years ago. I was working on my book, actually, and I saw the very first trailer for The Greatest Showman on YouTube.
Yes.
It had just dropped, and instantly my thought was, what would Todd Browning make of this? And I was even more intrigued when I finally saw the film, and of course the great set piece of that film, and as a result of that, the big popular image of the freak show is the song This Is Me.
Yes.
It's this very comforting, life-affirming hymn to embracing that which makes us different. That's a great message, and I've no qualms with that message. The way it's made, however, though, is something of a deceptive dilution. It's, you could argue it's almost tantamount to a cultural appropriation, in that This Is Me seizes on this subculture that you find depicted in the film Freaks, and it says, no, these people aren't really individuals, they're us, and we are them, and their differences are there to make us feel better about our own differences, and I can see a kind of logic in that, but the thing I really don't like is it kind of deprives people who have actually lived with these conditions that those of us who don't have them would find absolutely mind-bendingly debilitating to accommodate, it kind of deprives them of what made them so special, what made them so individual. We start to clap ourselves on the back a bit for being so tolerant, but I think there's a kind of buried intolerance there. It certainly doesn't sit entirely easily with me. And funnily enough, I was thinking about this in sort of preparing for this podcast. You have the mantra, "This is me," in The Greatest Showman.
Yes.
In the film Freaks, you also have a three-word mantra, "One of
one
us."
of us, yeah.
One of us, Google Gabble. Well, I mean, one of us, to me, is... It kind of stands for a true individuality. The freaks are letting you in. You're not letting the freaks into your life. They're letting you into their circle and their lives. I think this just as well connects to a general point, which I've thought about a lot in relation to playing various monster characters, and I think it's a very, very important point to make, especially when we come to people who are deemed to be monsters, which, is sadly the way this film was marketed and the way its performers have often been seen. I think to alleviate some of the guilt we feel in perceiving these people as very, very different to us, is we start to hold them to a false standard of behaviour.
Aha, interesting, yes.
So in medieval times, for example, people with deformities were considered embodiments of the devil. They were evil. They look evil on the outside. They must be evil on the inside. What we've found more recently, as the world has become more tolerant, is people who are in any way different or ugly or shocking on the outside, we start to canonise them.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you look at something like the Elephant Man, he is presented as an absolute saint.
Yes.
And, I mean, fair enough. I think that's true to the majority of accounts we've had of the Elephant Man, of poor old John or Joseph Merrick.
Yes.
But it doesn't strike me as humanising. In fact, it isn't humanising.
Yeah.
It's saying, you look like this on the outside, therefore I'm going to perceive you to be this virtuous, saintly figure on the inside to make me feel better about your misfortune. Freaks doesn't buy into all of that. It's much more mature. It gets away from the whole Beauty and the Beast idea where the beast has to have gold on the inside. So Freaks, as crude and offensive as it may be to some, I think it is at least brave enough to show that these people are people. They are capable of bad behaviour. I mean, the marriage at the centre of the film is really an incredibly emotionally toxic thing, and a lot of that comes from Hans absolutely blinkering himself to how Frida feels about this alliance he enters into with Cleopatra.
It's very sad, that, actually, isn't it?
Sad,
I did find that very sad. There is something quite moving about this film, and you're so right about all of those things. There's probably a tendency that some filmmakers might have to put people like that on a pedestal and make them more saintly, and it doesn't. But what it does have as well is this thing that, regardless of what these people look like, because they live a certain lifestyle and together in this travelling carnival act, there is that pack mentality. There is that one of us mentality, which of course is what leads to that incredible climax, which still is an incredible horror sequence. I think it's beautifully directed. The people crawling through the mud in the thunder and lightning, and I think it's truly quite frightening, that end. Whether or not it kind of feels like a horror film up until that, I'm not sure, but at that moment you're really in a horror film.
Yes, I think you're absolutely on the mark there, and it's interesting that the members of the cast chosen to crawl through the mud and chase Cleopatra through the raging elements, they tend to be the performers who look least like your common or garden human being.
Yes.
So you don't get, for example, the conjoined twins, because they are sort of Hollywood beautiful. You do get poor old Prince Randian, who has neither arms nor legs and I think would really struggle for a good 2 hours to catch up with Cleopatra.
Yes,
as a result of that, he is there. He's there for visual purposes, not because it makes any sense practically. Yeah.
We touched upon this briefly already, but by the sounds of it, historically, the reactions to this movie, people were quite shocked, right, when they first saw it, and
oh yes,
the story goes that after the initial test screening, there was so much of the film they had to cut, apparently, because people just found it too much.
Well. Yeah, it's a really fascinating area, this idea of censorship imposed on the freaks, because I think this accounts for much of its reputation. Its legend precedes it.
Yes,
it's famous for being banned in this country, in our dear old Blighty, for a good 30 years, and I think even more entertaining than that is the situation that prevailed in America, where different states had their own censor boards who would cut the film to ribbons to conform to the sort of moral viewpoint of that particular state. So, I mean, I would dearly love to see the cut of the film that actually played in New York, because everything I've read on the subject says 30 minutes was cut from the film before it was shown in New York. Now, the film only runs about an hour.
Yes.
How that was presented, I have no idea, and what was left, I don't know.
I know.
Maybe the 20 minutes of plot and 10 minutes of less interesting material. Maybe it just ended before Cleopatra got her just desserts. I don't know. It's a complete mystery to me. So I'd love to see the cutting continuity for whatever happened in New York. Yeah, I mean, the actual kind of concrete information I found on the changes made to this film, it's kind of eye-opening, because the nature of the changes is quite diverse, and you have some things which were clearly abolished because of their horror content or taboos they may have walked straight into. So there was a scene, for example, where the seal, which Venus takes care of, started to get quite amorous with one of the so-called freaks. This poor girl who's not in the film very much, called she's called the Turtle Girl in a lot of things I've read. She's not in the film much. Her part has been cut to almost nothing. But she is, of course, there at the climax just to look frightening. It's really quite sad. Oddly enough, some of the other cuts aren't anything to do with the strangeness of some of the people in this film. So one of the bigger things cut were references to Venus's past as a prostitute.
Okay.
That was clearly considered much more objectionable.
That's funny.
Maybe, I mean, times march on, and we'd be inclined to regard such a person far more sympathetically these days. But maybe because she is one of the very few people in the film who is presented as kind of relatably normal, someone you could expect to meet in real life. Because that certainly isn't true of Cleopatra and Hercules. It's almost true of Frozzo the Clown, but he's pretty fucking weird as well. Maybe that was done not so much for the moral concern as to just make her a bit more relatable.
Right.
Although I think it would have been quite interesting to maintain that backstory. It would have created more of a unity insofar as suddenly everyone becomes a bit of a misfit, but for various different reasons. And interestingly, the really big cuts, which I'm sure we'll get on to discussing now, the really big cuts are in a way an addition, because the framing device of the Carnival Barker whipping up an aura of dreadful anticipation about just what happened to Cleopatra, that framing sequence was added in to cover up cuts that were made to the film. So originally, the film opened with the sequence we get a bit later now, with Madame Tetralini and some of the sideshow performers in that pool. I think that would have been a really interesting start to the film.
Yes.
Because you'd have the owner of this estate and the gamekeeper, or whoever he's meant to be, talking about these people as monsters who should be strangled at birth, and there should be laws made against them. And then you'd have had what is still in the film has shown, that initial shock of seeing them just gambling about, and then you would have gone into the compassionate defence. I think that would have been a wonderful kind of kaleidoscope of reactions to the people you find in this film, all of it at the outset of the film. Now, what you have instead is the carnival barker building up the terror, building up the horror, and you immediately look at the film through the lens of, oh, this is going to be really scary, this is going to be really frightening, I don't want to see what's in that pen which that woman has screamed at hysterically. It creates an atmosphere which is the opposite of compassion. And, of course, the framing sequence comes back at the end, and, that was partly or entirely to cover up for everything that's cut out of Cleopatra's scene being revenged upon by the freaks. So we go from her screaming in the forest quite abruptly back to the frame. And I find that a peculiar thing, because I wasn't able to quite determine this for myself, but if the film was conceived without the frame, surely that would have deprived us of a view of Cleopatra after the attack.
Yes, absolutely. We would never have known.
Yes, so surely the frame has made the film more shocking, more frightening. And actually, I'll just mention this as the last sort of thing. There was an additional element to the frame at the end, which was subsequently cut, which was we would see Hercules again.
Yes.
In the film, as it plays out, we just assume he's been killed. The film would present him singing in a falsetto to imply he was castrated by the
I love it.
And if any character in any film of any age deserved to be castrated, it is Hercules. But yet again, is it better or worse to suggest the freaks killed him? I don't know. I think it's kind of worse. They seem even more bastardly. They're not dragging him down to their level. Sorry, that's rather a crude way of putting it. You know, they're not making him one of us anymore. They are just ending his life. We should talk about this ending, shouldn't we?
Oh, I mean, it's just wonderful, isn't it? I mean, it's so bizarre, and I guess it feels. Is it supposed to be funny? Is it like a little punchline, a little end joke to you, do you think? Or is it genuinely supposed to be kind of frightening and shocking, or both? I'm not really sure. Are
you talking specifically about the
about the reveal of Cleopatra? Yeah. Yes.
So it's an interesting one. I've a very close friend here in York who tells me occasionally about her student days at university, and she ended up living in a flat with another friend who was just as pleasingly mad as she was, and to while away their poverty-stricken time together, they would occasionally just do impersonations of Cleopatra at the end of Freaks. They'd just get down on the floor and start squawking at each other and just finding it ridiculously funny. I mean, any image that can be converted into that sort of light entertainment can't be completely soul-crushingly disturbing. It is like the punchline to a very, very dark joke, I agree. Funnily enough, the costume that Cleopatra wears was devised by Lon Chaney for an earlier Todd Browning film, West of Zanzibar. We still have images of Lon Chaney wearing that very similar costume where he appears to have no legs. And that costume doesn't appear in West of Zanzibar, but Todd Browning wanted to cling on to the idea, so it's got that in-jokey extra feel to it anyway. It's a tribute to Todd Browning's favourite actor, the actor he loved beyond any others. So I think there is meant to be a seam of dark humour there. Yeah, I mean, I suppose what's even more pressing is just the stuff leading up to the reveal of Cleopatra, that terrifying sequence you referred to with the revenge of the
I love that.
The sideshow.
Yeah, I mean, it really works, doesn't it? It really works as a classic kind of piece of horror cinema, that particular sequence.
It certainly does. It's I mean, it's like a set piece that can be separated from everything that's gone before in the film. And I mean, how do you feel about it, Mike? Do you feel it demeans or diminishes that which has gone before? I'm just curious to get your views before I spout off with my own.
Well, I guess I'm kind of troubled by my feelings about it because, of course, there is a very valid argument here that these people are being portrayed as, they are literally being portrayed as monsters, aren't they? And that's not necessarily because of their actions, that's because of the way they look. They're being portrayed as monstrous because of the way they look. Which is sad because I think it does a great job at kind of disproving all of the silly myths about people that looked like that throughout the bulk of the film. It kind of undoes that at the end there, doesn't it? But having said that, of course, narratively, it's quite satisfying, right? Because they are getting revenge on the villain. Cleopatra's the baddie. Cleopatra and Hercules, what they're doing, they're plotting to kill them. So what we're seeing here, I guess, is a revenge movie, right? We are seeing the quote-unquote freaks getting their revenge. And there's been a huge tradition of revenge movies. And we don't feel bad when any of those characters take their revenge on the villains and kill them hideously. And so I'm in two minds about it. In some ways, I think it's a great ending because it's really satisfying and it's quite exciting and you kind of enjoy seeing these characters get their just desserts. On the other hand, I completely understand that the way it's done, the way it's portrayed, is, again, simply to make these people look monstrous. The way that they're kind of crawling through the mud, almost like they're kind of zombies coming out of the ground or something, right? So it's a really tricky one. I would be lying if I said I didn't love that ending, just purely because of the way that it looks. Just as a horror set piece, I think it's phenomenal. I think it is creepy and powerful and effective and a fitting climax to this story. It does the job.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with you. I think without that final sequence, the film's status as classic horror, or indeed any kind of horror, would be very, very weak indeed. It's the moment where the film being consciously tailored as horror product comes through clearest, isn't it? I'm fascinated by how later on in 1932 you got Island of Lost Souls, and that essentially restaged the ending of Freaks beat for beat. So as the Island of Lost Souls climax is building up, you have the moment where blood is spilt and suddenly the laws by which Dr. Moreau has been governing all of the behaviour on the island are broken. You have Bela Lugosi as the fur-faced sayer of the law, intoning as only Bela Lugosi can, "Law, no more." And, similarly in Freaks, the code of the freaks has been broken. It's been violated by Cleopatra. So then, in Island of Lost Souls and Freaks both, the misfit quote-unquote monsters become a mob, a lynch mob at that, who round on and graphically revenge themselves on their oppressor.
Yeah, there you go.
I think the difference between the films is we get a much greater sense of what happens at the end of Island of Lost Souls, because we have Charles Laughton discharging one of the most frightening sounds ever heard in any film, that scream of pain, which also seems hysterically gliding in the direction of enjoyment.
Yes.
A horrible noise.
Yes.
Whereas in Freaks, everything's quite truncated. We see Cleopatra screaming in fear in the forest, and then the film goes back to the frame.
Yes.
Now, I think this is something that actually invites a weird kind of defence of the ending. Because it is so humane up to that point that I would like to try and persuade people as much as possible that that ending is not quite as dreadful as it's often built up to be. Playing devil's advocate, essentially.
Yes.
Because, if someone says the ending is indefensible, I really can't argue with them. But I think there are mitigating factors here. So, let's try and think of it as if we were defending these people for what they did to Cleopatra in a courtroom setting. What would you put together in your dossier? So, you have, first of all, and this is very important, Cleopatra has tried and nearly succeeded in murdering Hans. I think this very often gets forgotten about. And the thing that almost always gets forgotten about is, on the very night where they are enacting this revenge, Hercules is breaking into a caravan trying to kill Venus because he suspects she knows too much. So what would happen if these two horrible, horrible human beings weren't put in their place? It becomes, a question of deciding who dies. And I think morally the right people are revenged upon. I think the ending as well is interesting, but it reminds you how ritualistic Todd Browning was as a filmmaker. So you can, to an extent, regard the ending as maybe more Todd Browning playing out a personal preoccupation, how he felt his film should go, than casting a particular aspersion on the cast. Because I don't think Todd Browning really intended to present these performers as monsters. He was just so tantalised by the weird and the strange that he probably wouldn't see the ending as being particularly objectionable. I know that sounds implausible, but, you look at his other films which have a kind of sideshow backdrop, and they all of them pivot on a performance set piece. One of the odd things with Freaks is you don't really ever see the freak show playing out before an audience. In fact, you may never see it.
I know.
You sort of
strange
peek
that.
through the tent flaps of the circus, but you never actually see them perform. So I think the ending of Freaks is Todd Browning trying to lure a performance into the film. Now, what I mean by this is, you look at his previous films set in sideshows, and they all of them have a performance set piece where there is an element of danger. And we're talking life and death danger. So you look to The Unknown with Lon Chaney, and you have, first of all, Lon Chaney's knife act, where he's throwing knives at Joan Crawford with his feet. That's his standard performance. And also the ending of that film, where he is using the strongman's carnival act and sabotaging it to try and rip his arms from his body. The strongman's act consists of holding the reins of two horses moving in opposite directions who are on treadmills. Lon Chaney's character stops for treadmills, and the horses nearly pull the strongman's arms off. So there you have it, a dangerous performance set piece. It's this thing Todd Browning has of wanting to show the carnival or the sideshow as a place of danger, life and death danger, and he finally does it at the end of Freaks. It's just not a performance you would ever expect based on what has gone before. And the final thing, and this is possibly the best defence to be advanced in the favour of the so-called Freaks, is we don't finally know what they do to Cleopatra. Originally, in the scene as filmed, what did the brunt of the damage to Cleopatra was a tree falling. Now, I find that interesting because, I mean, you look at her in her guise as that kind of human duck, and is there that much that's been done to her that we can say wasn't done by the tree? I mean, there's a suggestion she can't speak, but she could have been so mentally unhinged by the accident that she has lost her ability to speak or decided not to speak. And her face is somewhat deformed, but, I mean, that could also have happened. I mean, she's had a fucking tree fall on her, for God's sake. So this is an example, and this happens so often with censorship imposed by a studio or an outside force, where cutting something actually creates a worse scenario.
Yes, oh, totally. Yeah.
Because we are now left to imagine all sorts of terrible things the performers might have done to her that don't involve a falling tree. And indeed, the Carnival Barker's patter kind of builds us up to that. Do we condemn them for chasing Cleopatra towards that tree that fell on her? Or do we condemn them for what they wanted to do? It's always a funny one how this kind of Deus ex machina intervenes, and then you're left in this ambiguous space. It's hard to come to a conclusion.
It is.
I can't deny that the ending feels exploitative, but if you want to defend it, I think you have grounds for doing so.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It all adds to a film like that in terms of its historic reputation and its legacy and its legend, like you said. And I think there's always going to be elements of this film that, as dated as some parts of it might feel, it's still kind of... There's still something about it that I think people will continuously, generation upon generation, will probably continue to be curious to see what this film is, just by its title, just by its poster, just by its legend, I suppose.
Absolutely. It's curious to note at this point in time, 2020, that many, if not most, US states have banned the exhibition of people of physical difference, on the grounds of exploitation.
Yes.
It's curious to cast an eye over the cast of this film and wonder, well, how many of these people did enjoy autonomy? How many did feel in control of their lives?
Yeah.
How many felt abused or misused, and how many felt empowered by being able to make the most of a limitation?
Yeah.
Or what the world at large would perceive to be a limitation.
Yeah.
How many existed in that kind of liminal space going between the two? It's
yeah, you're absolutely right.
It's really, really very thought-provoking.
It is. It's a complex area. It's very thought-provoking. Well, I'm going to have to wrap it up, I think. But, James, this has been absolutely wonderful. Both films where there is just so much. There's an abundance to discuss, I think.
Oh, entirely.
Thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find you out there on social media, etc., James, if they want to come and pick your brain about these films or anything else?
Well, they're entirely welcome to do so, but I don't know why they'd want to. I'm on Twitter. My handle is James C, the letter C, Swanton, James C. Swanton. Same handle on Instagram, though I hate Instagram, so I use it rarely. I have a website, jamesswanton.com, which, I hope and pray will be full of different performances I'm doing. God knows what the future holds, but... yes, I am in the world, in a cyber form at least, and these are the ways you can ferret me out.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, James Swanton. Such a pleasure to have James back on the podcast. I hope he will return again very soon. So please do send in your thoughts. I know there is so much to discuss about these two movies, and probably loads that we missed. So please, all of you, come and continue the discussion. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and on Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, simply join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. If you want to support this podcast financially and get treated to weekly bonus content, you can head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You will get access to bonus episodes every other week. This week we dropped an episode in which me and Rihanna Dillon discussed The Vast of Night, that wonderful new sci-fi horror which dropped on Amazon about a month ago. Not only that, if you sign up to our $10 Patreon level, you will get access to weekly bonus episodes, which means you'll also get to listen to our exclusive mini-seasons. We are currently in the middle of a mini-series in which we are covering the whole of Twin Peaks, David Lynch's brilliant Twin Peaks, from beginning to end. All you need to do is sign up at a $10 level to get access to that. One more time, head over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Acast, Stitcher, Libsyn, and Spotify. If you get a chance, please do subscribe subscribe to us, please do tell your friends and family about us. And if you get a spare minute, if you want to support this podcast but you can't afford to do it financially on Patreon, a great way to support us would be to drop us a little review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Onwards and upwards then as we move into part 4 of this brilliant Mind and Body series. Next week I am going to be joined by Rhianna Dillon, and we are going to be discussing 2 psychological classics, a kind of double bill of madness, hysteria and gaslighting. Next week, Rhianna is going to be joining me to discuss Henry George Clouzot's Diabolique from 1955 and Roman Polanski's Repulsion from 1965. Holy shit, what a double bill. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.